John Martinez woke up that Tuesday morning like he had every other morning for the past 37 years. The alarm went off at 5:30, and he was out the door by 6, coffee in hand, ready to work his land in rural Montana. He'd been farming this same stretch of property since he was 23 years old, taking it over from his father who'd worked it before him. By now he knew every inch of these fields like he knew the lines on his own hands. The autumn air had that crisp bite to it that John actually enjoyed. It meant the harvest season was winding down, and soon he'd have a bit more time to relax before winter set in. He climbed onto his old tractor, the same one he'd been using for 15 years, and headed out to the southern field near the oak grove. This part of the land always needed extra attention. Being closest to the woods where rocks and roots seemed to multiply overnight, the tractor was humming along nicely, the plow cutting through the soil just right. When suddenly the whole machine lurched forward like it had hit a wall, John's coffee went flying, splashing across the dashboard, and he had to grab the wheel hard to keep from losing control. He'd hit plenty of rocks before, but this felt different, heavier, more solid. He killed the engine and climbed down, already annoyed at the thought of another huge boulder he'd have to dig out and haul away. His back wasn't getting any younger, and these surprise obstacles were becoming more of a problem each year. But when he walked around to see what he'd hit, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, half exposed in the freshly turned soil, was something he'd never seen before in all his years of farming. At first glance, they looked like eggs. Big ones, really big ones, but they were black, not dark brown or speckled like bird eggs usually are. These were pure black, so dark they seemed to swallow up the morning sunlight instead of reflecting it. John crouched down and counted them. 7 eggs arranged in what looked like a perfect circle. Each one was about the size of a large grapefruit, maybe bigger. He reached out slowly and touched one, half expecting it to be cold like stone. But it was warm. Not hot, but definitely warmer than the cool autumn soil around it. The surface was strange too. Smooth in some spots, but with a texture that was almost rough when he ran his fingers across it. It reminded him a little bit of that fancy pottery his wife Maria had bought at an art fair once. But even that didn't quite match. This was something else entirely. John stood up and pulled out his phone, his mind racing. What in the world were these things? Some kind of dinosaur eggs? No, that was ridiculous. Dinosaurs had been gone for millions of years. And besides, he'd seen pictures of dinosaur eggs in museums. They looked nothing like this. These were too perfect, too uniform, too weird. He called Maria's number and waited while it rang. She picked up on the 3rd ring, probably wondering why he was calling so early when he usually worked straight through until lunch. "Han, you need to come out to the south field right now," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "And bring David. I found something strange." Maria knew her husband well enough to know that strange, coming from a man who rarely got excited about anything, meant this was worth seeing. 20 minutes later, she and their 16-year-old son David were walking across the field toward where John stood waiting by the tractor. "What's going on, Dad?" David called out as they got closer. "Mom said you found something weird." John just pointed at the ground. Maria and David came around the tractor and saw the eggs. Both of them stopped walking at exactly the same moment. Their expressions mirror images of confusion and amazement. "What are those?" Maria whispered, as if speaking too loudly might disturb them. "That's what I'd like to know," John replied. "I was plowing and hit them. They were buried about a foot down, I'd say." David, who was taking biology classes at the high school and had always been interested in nature, immediately pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. He walked around the circle of eggs, photographing them from different angles, his young face scrunched up in concentration. "These can't be bird eggs," he said after a minute. "They're too big, and I've never heard of any bird that lays black eggs like this. Maybe some kind of fungus, like a puffball mushroom or something?" Maria shook her head. "Fungi don't grow in perfect circles with perfect sphere shapes like this. This is something else." The 3 of them stood there in the field, staring at the eggs, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun was climbing higher now, and a few birds were singing in the oak trees nearby, completely oblivious to the strange discovery happening just a few hundred yards away. "Should we call someone?" Maria asked. "Like the agricultural office? Or maybe the university?" John scratched his head, his farmer's cap pushed back on his forehead. "Call them and say what? That I found some weird black eggs? They'll think I'm crazy." "We could send them the pictures David took," Maria suggested. "Let them decide if it's worth looking into." But David was shaking his head. Before we call anyone, maybe we should do some research online. See if we can figure out what these are ourselves. I mean, what if they're nothing special and we end up looking like idiots? John had to admit the kid had a point. Still, something about these eggs made his skin prickle with unease. They didn't belong here. He couldn't explain how he knew that, but he knew it in his gut the same way he knew when a storm was coming or when the soil wasn't quite right for planting. I think we should move them, he said finally. Get them out of the field and somewhere we can keep an eye on them. The barn, maybe, in one of the empty stalls. Maria looked uncertain. Is that safe? What if they're, I don't know, toxic or something? They're warm to the touch and I've already handled them, John pointed out. If they were going to poison me, I'd probably be feeling it by now. Besides, I can't just leave them here. What if it rains? Or animals get to them? After some more discussion, they all agreed. John went back to the house and returned with a large plastic storage bin lined with old towels. Very carefully, he lifted each egg and placed it gently in the bin. They were heavier than he expected, each one probably weighing 5 or 6 pounds. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was doing something important, something that mattered in a way he couldn't yet understand. They carried the bin to the barn, David and John holding one end each while Maria walked ahead to open doors. Inside, they chose the stall that used to house their old mare before she'd passed away last spring. It was clean, dry, and away from the other animals. John set up a bed of fresh hay and arranged the eggs carefully, trying to recreate the circle pattern they'd been in when he found them. Now what? David asked, staring at the eggs with wide eyes. Now we watch them, John said, and we wait. Maria pulled out her phone and started taking more pictures, making notes about the date, time, and exact location where they'd been found. Always the organized one in the family, she wanted to document everything properly, just in case this turned out to be something important. As the morning wore on and turned into afternoon, word spread despite their intentions to keep it quiet. John's neighbor Tom stopped by to borrow a tool and ended up spending an hour in the barn, staring at the eggs and offering theories that ranged from reasonable to completely absurd. By evening, 3 more neighbors had found excuses to drop by, and each one left more confused than when they'd arrived. That night, John lay in bed unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling. Through the window, he could see the barn illuminated by the security light they kept on all night. Somewhere in that building, in the old horse stall, 7 mysterious black eggs sat waiting. Waiting for what, he didn't know. But he had a feeling that his life, his family's life, maybe even his understanding of the world itself, was about to change in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. Tomorrow, he decided, they'd start making calls. They'd reach out to the university, to scientists, to anyone who might be able to explain what they'd found. Because one thing was becoming increasingly clear to John Martinez as he finally drifted off to sleep. These eggs were just the beginning of something much bigger. Something that had been buried in his land for who knows how long, waiting for exactly this moment to be discovered. The creature that stepped out of the broken shell was a bird. Just a bird. That's what John tried to tell himself as he stared at it, his mouth hanging open like he'd forgotten how to close it. But even as the thought formed in his mind, he knew it wasn't quite right. Yes, it had feathers and wings and a beak. It was definitely a bird. But there was something profoundly wrong, or maybe profoundly right about it. It was about the size of a large crow, maybe a bit bigger. Its feathers were the same impossible black as the egg had been, but when the light hit them just right, they shimmered with deep purples and blues, like oil on water. The bird stood perfectly still for a moment, as if getting its bearings, water from the egg still dripping off its feathers. Then it turned its head and looked directly at John. And that's when he felt his blood run cold. The eyes. The bird's eyes were large and dark, but there was something in them that didn't belong in any animal John had ever seen. Intelligence. Not the simple awareness of a clever dog or even a smart parrot. This was different. When this bird looked at you, you got the distinct feeling it was thinking about you, analyzing you, understanding you in ways that made you deeply uncomfortable. "What is it?" Maria whispered, her voice shaking. Dr. Chen had her phone out and was taking rapid-fire photographs, her hands trembling so badly that half the pictures were probably blurry. "I don't know," she said, and John could hear genuine fear in her voice. "I've never seen anything like this. The morphology is similar to corvids, maybe, but that's where the similarity ends." As they watched, the other 6 eggs began to split open, one after another. The process was faster now, as if the first bird's emergence had triggered something in the others. Within 10 minutes, 7 identical birds stood in the stall, all of them shaking off the last remnants of their shells, all of them looking around with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. What happened next made John question his sanity. The birds didn't stumble around like newborn chicks should. They didn't cheep helplessly or flop over trying to find their balance. Instead, they walked. Deliberately and steadily, they began exploring the stall, examining the hay, the wooden walls, the water bucket John had placed in the corner days ago. One of them walked right up to David and tilted its head, studying him. David, to his credit, held his ground, though John could see his son's hands were balled into fists at his sides. The bird made a soft sound, not quite a chirp or a caw. It was melodic, almost like someone humming a tune. Then another bird answered with a similar sound, but different. A different note. A different melody. Are they talking to each other? One of Dr. Chen's graduate students asked. A young man named Peter who looked like he was about to pass out. Dr. Chen didn't answer. She was too busy recording everything on her phone, moving slowly around the stall to get different angles. "We need to contain them," she said finally. "Set up a larger space where they can move around but can't escape. And we need to call more people. This is beyond my expertise." The rest of that evening passed in a blur. They cleared out the entire section of the barn that had been used for storage, creating a large enclosed area for the birds. John and David moved everything carefully while Maria and Dr. Chen supervised the birds, making sure none of them tried to fly away, though, curiously, none of them seemed interested in escaping. By midnight, the birds were settled in their new space, and Dr. Chen had made approximately 20 phone calls. She'd contacted ornithologists, geneticists, and even a few government agencies, though she'd been vague about the details. "I can't just tell them we have 7 birds that might be a completely unknown species," she'd explained. "They'll think I'm insane. We need evidence first." DNA samples, detailed behavioral observations, everything documented. The Martinez family finally trudged back to the house around 1 in the morning. They were exhausted, overwhelmed, and more than a little frightened. As John lay in bed next to Maria, staring at the ceiling again, he thought about how his life had completely changed in just 4 days. Last Tuesday, his biggest worry had been whether he'd finish plowing before the weather turned. Now he was harboring 7 impossible birds that had hatched from mysterious eggs buried in his field. "What do you think they are?" Maria asked in the darkness, echoing the question they'd all been asking. "I don't know," John admitted, "but I don't think they're just birds. There's something more going on here." Sunday morning brought new developments that made everything even stranger. David was the first one to the barn as usual. He liked spending time with the birds, fascinated by their behavior in a way that only a teenager obsessed with biology could be. But when he walked into their enclosed area, he froze. The birds had arranged things, small objects that had been scattered around the space, bits of wood and straw and a few tools that had been left behind, were now laid out in deliberate patterns, not random, not accidental. The birds had organized them into shapes, circles, lines, triangles. David ran to get his parents and Dr. Chen, who had spent the night in the Martinez's guest room. When they all saw what the birds had done, nobody spoke for a full minute. "That's impossible," Dr. Chen finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Birds don't do this. Even the smartest corvids don't arrange objects into geometric patterns. This level of abstract thinking, it's..." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought, but it got worse. Or better. John wasn't sure which. One of the birds, the first one that had hatched, walked up to where they were standing by the fence they'd erected. It looked at them for a moment, then walked over to a patch of dirt on the barn floor. Using its beak, it began to deliberately scratch lines in the dirt. At first, the lines seemed random, but as the bird continued, a pattern emerged. It was drawing, not just making marks, but actually creating an image. The other 6 birds gathered around, watching. Some of them made those melodic sounds again, as if commenting on what was being created. When the bird finally stepped back, they all stared at what it had drawn. It was crude but recognizable. The bird had drawn a simple map. It showed the barn, the house, and the field where John had found the eggs. And in that field, there were 7 marks, 7 X's indicating specific locations. Maria was the first to speak, her voice barely audible. "Is it telling us something? Is it showing us where it came from?" Dr. Chen pulled out her phone and took pictures of the drawing. Her hands were steadier now, as if the scientist in her was taking over from the shocked human. We need to investigate those locations. Whatever's going on here, I think those spots marked on this map are important. They spent the rest of Sunday preparing for an excavation. Dr. Chen called in favors from colleagues, and by Monday morning, a small team had assembled on the Martinez property. There were archaeologists, geologists, and more biologists. Everyone wanted to be part of whatever this was. The first location marked on the bird's map was on a small hill at the eastern edge of John's property. It was a spot he knew well, a place where he'd thought about building a shed years ago but had never gotten around to it. As the team began to dig, the 7 birds watched from inside the barn, visible through the windows. John could swear they looked interested, almost excited. It didn't take long. 2 feet down, the archaeologist's shovel hit something solid, something that made a metallic sound that echoed across the field. They dug more carefully after that, brushing away dirt with small tools and brushes, revealing what lay beneath inch by inch. What they found was a cylinder. It was about 3 feet long and maybe 8 inches in diameter, made from the same strange black material as the eggs had been. The surface was smooth and unmarked, giving no indication of what might be inside or how old it might be. Dr. Chen carefully lifted it from the ground and carried it to a table they'd set up under a canopy. With the team gathered around, she examined it closely, looking for any way to open it. There were no visible seams, no buttons or latches. It appeared to be a solid piece. "Try twisting the ends," suggested one of the archaeologists, a woman named Dr. Patricia Morrison who specialized in ancient artifacts. Dr. Chen did, and after some effort the cylinder began to open. A faint hissing sound escaped as whatever seal had kept it closed for who knows how long finally broke. Inside, protected from time and elements, were scrolls. They were made from some kind of paper-like material that was flexible but incredibly strong. When Dr. Morrison carefully unrolled the first one, they all gasped. The scroll was covered in writing and detailed illustrations. The writing was in a language none of them recognized, symbols and characters that looked almost familiar, but weren't quite like anything in any known language system. But the illustrations they could understand. They showed people, a civilization of some kind living in harmony with birds, not just any birds. The exact same birds that were currently living in John's barn. The scrolls depicted these people and birds working together, communicating, building structures, creating art. Over the next 3 days, they excavated all 7 locations marked on the bird's map. Each site contained a similar cylinder. Each cylinder held more scrolls, and with each discovery, the picture became clearer and more astounding. There had been a civilization here thousands of years ago, a people who had developed an advanced culture in this very valley, and they had lived alongside these remarkable birds, these creatures that were far more than just animals. The scrolls showed shared knowledge, cooperative hunting, and what could only be described as friendship between 2 species. Dr. Chen brought in linguistic experts to examine the writing. They estimated the scrolls were at least 3,000 years old, possibly older. Carbon dating would be needed to confirm it, but the material itself was unlike anything they'd ever seen. It hadn't degraded at all, as if it had been created specifically to last forever. One evening, as the team was reviewing the day's findings, one of the linguists made a breakthrough. She'd been comparing the symbols on the scrolls to various ancient languages and had found some similarities to pictographic systems used by indigenous peoples across the Americas. With this as a starting point, she began to decode portions of the text. What she translated made everyone go silent. The scrolls weren't just historical records. They were a message. A message from the ancient civilization to whoever found them. And the message explained everything. The civilization had faced some kind of catastrophe. Environmental changes, perhaps, or disease, or maybe conflict. The scrolls weren't clear on the exact cause. But they knew their time was ending. They couldn't save themselves, but they wanted to save their knowledge and their relationship with the birds. So they created the eggs, using methods that the modern scientists couldn't even begin to understand. They had placed the birds in a state of suspended development, sealed them in eggs made from material designed to last millennia, and buried them in strategic locations. The eggs were designed to hatch only when conditions were right. When the land had healed, when the environment was stable enough to support the birds again. They had been waiting for 3,000 years for the right moment. And that moment had come when John's plow had disturbed the first set of eggs. But there was more. The final scroll, found in the last cylinder, contained the most important information. It explained what the birds were, what they could do, and why the ancient civilization had valued them so highly. The birds weren't just intelligent. They were environmental guardians. They could sense changes in the ecosystem long before any human technology could detect them. They could predict weather patterns, identify pollution, sense seismic activity. They were living warning systems. And more than that, they seemed to understand the interconnected nature of the environment in ways that humans struggled to grasp even with all their modern knowledge. The ancient civilization had relied on these birds to help them live in balance with the land. And now, 3,000 years later, the birds had returned. Not by accident, by design. The ancient people had looked into the future and had given humanity a gift. A second chance to learn what they had known, to benefit from the wisdom of these remarkable creatures. John stood in his barn that night, looking at the 7 birds that had changed his life. They looked back at him with those intelligent eyes, and he wondered what they were thinking. Did they understand what they were? Did they remember somehow the civilization that had created their eggs? One of the birds, the first one that had hatched, walked up to the fence. It made one of those melodic sounds, and to John's amazement, it sounded almost like a word, like it was trying to communicate in human language. The world was about to learn about the birds. Dr. Chen had finally made the calls to major institutions and media outlets. By tomorrow, this farm would be swarming with people, all wanting to see the impossible creatures that had emerged from eggs buried for 3,000 years. But tonight, it was just John and the birds standing in the quiet barn, both ancient and new, both human and other, sharing a moment that bridged a gap of millennia. And John realized that his life would never be ordinary again, that the responsibility he now carried was enormous. He was the guardian of something precious, something that represented a connection to a lost past and possibly the key to a better future. The birds watched him, waiting to see what would happen next. And John, for all his uncertainty and fear and wonder, knew that he would protect them. Whatever came next, he would make sure these incredible creatures survived, because they were more than just birds. They were a message from the past, a warning, a gift, and possibly the most important discovery in human history. The news broke on a Thursday morning, exactly 2 weeks after John had first discovered the eggs. Within hours, the Martinez farm became the center of worldwide attention. News vans lined the road leading to the property. Helicopters circled overhead trying to get footage. John had to hire security just to keep people from trespassing. Dr. Chen held a press conference at the university, carefully explaining what they'd found. She showed pictures of the eggs, the birds, and some of the scrolls, though she was careful to hold back certain details until they could be properly documented and studied. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every major news outlet covered the story. Scientists from around the world reached out, wanting to be involved in the research. But amid all the chaos and excitement, something else was happening that nobody outside the inner circle knew about yet. The birds were changing, growing, and not in any normal way. David was the first to notice. He'd been measuring the birds every day as part of Dr. Chen's research protocol. On day 1 after hatching, the largest bird had been about 14 inches tall. 3 days later, it was 18 inches. A week after that, it was over 2 feet tall. That wasn't normal. That wasn't possible. Birds didn't grow that fast, especially not adult birds, which these clearly were based on their fully developed feathers and coordination. They're not following any biological rules we understand, Dr. Chen said during one of the team meetings held in John's living room, which had become an impromptu research headquarters. Their metabolism is completely unlike anything in modern birds. They're processing nutrients at an impossible rate. If they keep growing at this pace, they'll be the size of large dogs within a month. But the growth rate wasn't the strangest thing. The birds were learning, fast, too fast. Within days of hatching, they'd figured out how to open simple latches. They'd learned which times of day the humans would bring food. They'd even started responding to their names, because David, in his teenage way, had insisted on naming them. The first one, the leader as they'd come to think of it, David had named Atlas. It seemed fitting for a creature carrying the weight of 3,000 years on its shoulders. The others were named after constellations: Orion, Lyra, Phoenix, Cassiopeia, Draco, and Vega. Dr. Chen had rolled her eyes at the dramatic names. but even she had started using them. It was Atlas who provided the next major breakthrough. 10 days after hatching, the bird did something that made everyone stop and reconsider everything they thought they knew. John had been in the barn, talking to Dr. Morrison, the archaeologist, about the scrolls. They were standing near the bird's enclosure, and Atlas was watching them with that intense focus the birds seemed to have. John was describing where he'd found the eggs, using his hands to gesture, painting a picture with his words. Atlas hopped down from its perch and walked to the patch of dirt it had used before to draw the map. But this time it didn't just scratch random marks. It began to draw with purpose, and what emerged was stunning. It was a detailed topographical map of the entire Martinez property, complete with elevation changes indicated by careful line work. The barn, the house, the fields, the oak grove, everything was there in remarkable detail. But that wasn't all. Atlas added 7 new marks to the map. 7 locations that hadn't been excavated yet. 7 more buried cylinders, presumably with more scrolls, more information, more pieces of the puzzle. Dr. Morrison stared at the drawing, her professional composure completely gone. "It's communicating complex spatial information," she said, her voice shaking. "It's not just intelligent. It understands human methods of representation. It knows what a map is and how to create one that we can interpret." They excavated the 7 new locations over the next week. Each one did indeed contain a cylinder. These scrolls were different from the first batch. They contained more detailed information about the birds themselves. How to care for them, how to communicate with them, what they needed to survive and thrive. It was like finding an instruction manual written 3,000 years ago. One scroll in particular caught everyone's attention. It described the birds' abilities in detail, abilities that went far beyond what they'd already observed. According to the ancient text, the birds could sense changes in air pressure and temperature with extraordinary precision. They could detect subtle shifts in the Earth's magnetic field. They could perceive wavelengths of light invisible to human eyes. They were essentially living sensor arrays, capable of monitoring the environment in ways that modern technology struggled to match. But there was something else, something that made Dr. Chen go pale when the linguist translated it. The scroll indicated that the birds could share information with humans. Not through speech exactly, but through a form of sensory transfer. If a human spent enough time with the birds, learned to understand their behaviors and signals, the birds could somehow convey what they were sensing. The scroll called it the connection. "This is impossible," Dr. Chen said, reading and rereading the translation. "This is describing some kind of neurological link between species. We don't have any evidence that's possible. We didn't have evidence that birds could be preserved in eggs for 3,000 years either," Dr. Morrison pointed out. "Maybe we need to stop thinking about what's possible and start dealing with what's real." They decided to test it. David volunteered immediately, much to Maria's horror. But John surprised everyone, including himself, by volunteering as well. "If anyone's going to try this, it should be me," he said firmly. "This is my land, my discovery, my responsibility." Dr. Chen set up a controlled experiment. John would spend 4 hours a day with the birds, specifically with Atlas, trying to establish this connection the scrolls described. They'd monitor his brain activity, his vital signs, everything they could think of. If something seemed dangerous, they'd stop immediately. The first few days were frustrating. John sat in the enclosure feeling ridiculous, trying to connect with a bird while scientists watched and took notes. Atlas would watch him with those intelligent eyes, occasionally making soft melodic sounds, but nothing seemed to happen. John felt no different. He sensed nothing unusual. On the 4th day, something changed. John was sitting quietly, just observing Atlas, when suddenly he felt something. It wasn't a sound or a sight. It was more like a sensation, a knowing. He became aware of air currents in the barn, subtle movements he'd never noticed before. He could feel the temperature gradients, warmer near the ceiling, cooler near the floor. It was like his perception had expanded, like he'd gained new senses he didn't have words for. Atlas made a sound, and John understood it, not in words, but in meaning. The bird was pleased. The connection was forming. Over the next week, the sensation grew stronger. John found himself knowing things he shouldn't know. He'd walk outside and sense that rain was coming hours before the sky showed any signs of it. He'd feel tension in the ground beneath his feet, subtle vibrations that spoke of underground water flow, or maybe even seismic activity. The world had become richer, more complex, more alive. Dr. Chen was fascinated and terrified. The brain scans showed unusual activity in John's sensory processing centers, patterns they'd never seen before. "It's like your brain is receiving new types of input," she explained. "But we can't determine how. There's no physical connection between you and the bird. It shouldn't be possible." "But it is possible," John said. "And I'm telling you, these birds can sense things we can't. They know things about this land, about the environment, that would take our technology years to discover." As if to prove his point, Atlas did something remarkable. The bird began to act agitated, pacing back and forth, making urgent sounds. The other 6 birds picked up on it, all of them showing signs of distress. John felt it through the connection, a warning of some kind, something wrong in the environment, but not immediate, not close. He tried to understand what Atlas was trying to tell him. He closed his eyes, letting the sensations wash over him, and suddenly he knew. There was a problem with the aquifer beneath the eastern part of his property. The water table was dropping. Contamination was seeping in from somewhere upstream. It was subtle, nothing that would show obvious symptoms for months, maybe years. But the birds knew. They could sense the chemical changes in the groundwater, the shift in the underground ecosystem. John explained what he was sensing to Dr. Chen, who looked skeptical, but called in a hydrogeologist to test the aquifer. 2 days later, the tests came back. John was right. There was early-stage contamination from an old chemical storage facility 5 miles upstream. It hadn't reached dangerous levels yet, but if left unchecked, it would eventually poison the entire water system for the region. The discovery made headlines. The birds hadn't just predicted the contamination. They'd detected it long before modern testing methods would have found it. Suddenly, everyone understood what the ancient civilization had known 3,000 years ago. These birds were invaluable. They were guardians, early warning systems, partners in maintaining environmental health. But with that understanding came danger. Within days of the news breaking, John started getting calls. Companies wanting to buy the birds. Governments wanting to study them, take them away for research. Military contractors hinting at applications for surveillance and detection. Even well-meaning environmental organizations pushing to have the birds declared protected species and removed from private ownership. John refused every offer. The birds weren't for sale. They weren't property to be transferred. And he was becoming increasingly certain that the ancient civilization had chosen to bury the eggs on this land for a reason. This was where the birds were meant to be. Maria worried constantly. What if someone tries to take them by force? She asked one night as they lay in bed. We can't protect them from the government, from corporations with unlimited resources. John didn't have a good answer. He just knew that he couldn't let the birds be taken. The connection he'd formed with Atlas was growing stronger every day. He could sense the birds' contentment here, its sense of belonging. The other 6 birds were forming similar bonds with David, and even with some of the research team members who spent the most time with them. It was Dr. Morrison who found the answer in the scrolls. She'd been working on translating a particularly complex section when she discovered something crucial. The ancient civilization had left instructions, a legal framework of sorts, written in their language but clearly intended to protect the birds and whoever cared for them. The scrolls declared that the land where the eggs were found was sacred ground. Anyone who discovered the eggs became the guardian, with rights and responsibilities that superseded normal property laws. It was a 3,000-year-old legal document, and while it had no standing in modern courts, it represented something important: the intentions of the civilization that had created this entire situation. Dr. Chen used this, along with the incredible scientific importance of keeping the birds in their original environment, to argue for a special protected status, not for the birds alone but for the entire site. The Martinez farm would become a research preserve, with John and his family maintaining ownership and primary guardianship, but with legal protections that would keep corporations and governments from seizing the birds. It took weeks of negotiation, lawyers flying in from Washington, meetings with Montana state officials, and more paperwork than John had seen in his entire life. But eventually it was done. The Martinez Bird Preserve was officially established, the first of its kind, protecting not just an endangered species but the relationship between that species and its human guardians. Through it all, the birds continued to grow and learn, By the end of the second month, they were the size of large eagles, though they looked nothing like any eagle that had ever existed. Their intelligence had developed to the point where they could solve complex puzzles, use simple tools, and communicate remarkably sophisticated ideas through their system of melodic calls and, for those with the connection, through direct sensory sharing. Atlas had become John's constant companion. The bird would follow him around the property during his daily work, alert him to problems, even seem to offer something like comfort when John was stressed or worried. It wasn't a pet. It wasn't even quite a partner in the traditional sense. It was something new, something the modern world had no category for. One evening, John stood at the edge of his property watching the sunset with Atlas perched on a fence post beside him. Through the connection, he could feel what the bird was sensing: the cooling air, the shift in wind patterns, the settling of the earth as temperature changed from day to night. But more than that, he could sense the bird's emotions: contentment, purpose, a sense of rightness about being here in this place at this time. "We were meant to find you, weren't we?" John said softly. "That's why you were buried here on my land. Someone 3,000 years ago knew that this exact spot, at this exact time, would be right." Atlas turned its head, looking at John with those remarkable eyes, and made a soft sound that John understood meant yes, or agreement, or acknowledgement. The connection didn't translate into words, but meaning was clear enough. The ancient civilization had sent a message across time. They'd preserved not just their knowledge and these remarkable birds, but a relationship, a way of living with the environment rather than against it. And now, 3,000 years later, that message had been received. The question was, what would humanity do with it? 6 months after John first plowed up those strange black eggs, the Martinez farm had become something else entirely. The property was still a working farm. John insisted on that, but it was also a research center, an educational facility, and a symbol of something much larger than any of them had imagined possible. The 7 birds, now fully grown to an impressive size nearly 4 feet tall, had become celebrities in their own right. But more importantly, they'd become proof of something the world desperately needed to see: that humans and nature could work together in ways science was only beginning to understand. The connection, as they'd all started calling it, wasn't unique to John anymore. David had formed a strong bond with Orion, the second bird to hatch. Dr. Chen had unexpectedly connected with Lyra. Even Maria, who'd been skeptical and frightened at first, had developed a relationship with Cassiopeia. Each bond was slightly different, each person receiving and interpreting the sensory information in their own way. What they'd learned from the birds had already started changing things. The contamination issue that Atlas had detected was just the beginning. Phoenix, the 4th bird, had alerted its connected human to unusual seismic patterns that led to the discovery of a previously unknown fault line. Draco had detected air quality changes that helped identify an illegal dumping operation 40 miles away before it could cause serious environmental damage. The birds weren't just environmental sensors, though. They were teachers, showing their human partners how to perceive the world differently, how to notice connections between things that seemed unrelated, how to think in terms of ecosystems rather than isolated problems. But the biggest discovery came from the final set of scrolls. Dr. Morrison and her team of linguists had been working tirelessly to translate everything, and 3 months after the initial discovery, they finally decoded the last cylinder. What they found changed everything once again. The ancient civilization hadn't just preserved the birds. They'd preserved themselves. Not physically, but their knowledge, their culture, their entire way of thinking was embedded in the information stored within the birds themselves. The scrolls explained that the birds carried more than just environmental awareness. They carried memories. Cultural memories passed down through some mechanism the ancient people had developed, a way of encoding information into the bird's very biology. When a human formed the connection with a bird, they weren't just gaining new senses. They were gaining access to 3,000 years of accumulated knowledge about living in harmony with the land. It explained why John had started having dreams about farming techniques he'd never heard of, but that worked remarkably well when he tried them. It explained why David suddenly understood complex ecological relationships that would normally take years of study to grasp. The birds were living libraries, carrying the wisdom of an entire lost civilization. Dr. Chen presented these findings at a special session of the International Science Congress. The response was mixed. Some scientists were excited, seeing limitless potential for learning and environmental restoration. Others were skeptical, insisting that more research was needed before making such extraordinary claims. A few were frightened, worried about the implications of a technology or biological system they didn't understand, but the evidence was undeniable. People who spent time with the birds who formed the connection came away changed. They understood environmental systems better. They made decisions that benefited both human needs and ecological health. They thought longer term, considering consequences that stretched years or decades into the future. Governments started reaching out, not to take the birds anymore, but to learn from them. Could more sites be found? Were there other eggs buried elsewhere waiting to be discovered? The Martinez Preserve became a training ground, teaching carefully selected individuals how to form the connection, how to interpret what the birds were sharing, how to apply that knowledge to real-world problems. John found himself in an unlikely position. He'd gone from being a simple farmer to being something like an ambassador. He traveled to conferences, spoke to politicians and scientists, explained over and over what he'd learned from Atlas and the other birds. He always brought Atlas with him. The birds seemed to understand the importance of these meetings, remaining calm even in crowds and strange places. During one such trip to Washington, D.C., John met with a committee of senators discussing environmental policy. He had Atlas perched on a special stand beside him, and as he spoke about what the birds had taught him, he felt the familiar sensation of the connection opening wider. Atlas was sharing something specific, something urgent. John paused mid-sentence, closing his eyes to better understand what the bird was trying to convey. When he opened them again, he looked directly at the committee chairman. "There's going to be a major storm," John said, "bigger than anything the current forecasting models are predicting. It'll hit the Gulf Coast in 17 days. Atlas can sense the atmospheric patterns forming over the Atlantic right now. The pressure systems, the temperature gradients, the way the winds are beginning to organize. Your meteorologist won't see it for at least another week, and by then it might be too late to properly prepare." The senators looked skeptical. But one of them, a woman from Louisiana who'd been following the bird discovery closely, insisted they check with the National Weather Service. A week later, when the forecasters finally started predicting what would become Hurricane Alexandra, one of the most powerful storms to hit the Gulf in decades, John received calls from all of them. Atlas's early warning gave coastal communities an extra 10 days to prepare, time that saved countless lives and millions of dollars in property. After that, nobody doubted the birds anymore. The Martinez Preserve received federal funding to expand. Other teams were dispatched to locations suggested by the birds, places where the ancient civilization might have buried more eggs. 3 additional sites were found over the next 2 months, each containing similar black eggs in various states, though none had hatched yet. The theory was that local environmental conditions needed to be right for each set to awaken. David, now 17 and preparing for college, had become something of an expert himself. He'd formed such a strong connection with Orion that the two were virtually inseparable. He'd already been accepted to several top universities with full scholarships, and he planned to study conservation biology with a focus on human-animal communication systems. His thesis proposal, submitted with his college applications, outlined a framework for establishing bird-human partnerships at environmental monitoring stations around the world. Maria had transformed the most. She'd always been practical, level-headed, the one who kept the family grounded, but her bond with Cassiopeia had opened something in her, a creativity and intuitive understanding that led her to develop educational programs for children visiting the preserve. She'd written a book about their experience, not a scientific text but a personal story that had become unexpectedly popular, helping ordinary people understand what the birds represented. As fall turned to winter and then to spring, the preserve settled into a rhythm. Research continued, but at a more sustainable pace. Visitors came, but in controlled numbers with proper educational frameworks in place. The birds thrived, and their human partners grew in understanding and capability. John stood in the same field where he'd found the eggs. Exactly 1 year after that morning when his tractor had struck something unusual, the field was planted now, growing strong and healthy. He'd used techniques that Atlas had somehow conveyed to him through the connection, methods that worked with the land's natural processes rather than against them. His yields were better than they'd ever been, and he was using a fraction of the fertilizers and pesticides he'd relied on before. Atlas stood beside him, and the other 6 birds were scattered across the property, each with their own preferred spots and daily routines. Through the connection, John could sense all of them, a constant gentle awareness at the back of his mind. He knew where each bird was, what they were doing, what they were sensing about the environment around them. The sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and purples. John felt a deep sense of contentment but also purpose. The ancient civilization had left them this gift, this opportunity to learn from the past and apply it to the future. They'd shown that there was another way to live, a better way that honored both human needs and the needs of the planet. He thought about all the scrolls they'd translated, all the knowledge they'd uncovered. But he also thought about the scrolls that remained, the ones they hadn't fully decoded yet. There were hints of other things the ancient people had learned, other partnerships they'd formed with different species, other technologies that looked like biology and biology that looked like technology. The eggs had been just the beginning. They were a test maybe, or a gateway. If humanity could learn to work with the birds to respect and understand what they represented, then maybe there would be more. Maybe the ancient civilization had left other gifts, other opportunities, buried and waiting for the right moment to be discovered. Atlas made a sound, that melodic tone that John had come to recognize as contentment. Through the connection, he felt what the bird was feeling, satisfaction at being home, at fulfilling the purpose encoded into its very existence 3,000 years ago, but also anticipation. The birds knew there was more to come, more to discover, more to learn. Dr. Morrison had found references in some of the later scrolls to other preserved sites, other locations where the ancient civilization had hidden knowledge and resources. The birds seemed to know where some of these were, but they were being selective about sharing that information. It was as if they were testing humanity, seeing if people were ready, if they could be trusted with greater knowledge and greater responsibility. As darkness fell and stars began appearing in the clear Montana sky, John made his way back to the house. Maria was cooking dinner, the smell of roasted chicken and vegetables drifting out through the open kitchen window. David was probably in his room, either studying or more likely hanging out with Orion. The two of them engaged in whatever it was they did when they thought nobody was watching, communicating, learning, growing together. Inside the house, warmth and light and family awaited. Outside, 7 remarkable birds kept watch over the land, sensing things humans couldn't sense, understanding patterns too complex for human minds to easily grasp, carrying within them the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had learned to live in true balance with nature. John paused at the door and looked back one more time. Atlas had followed him to the house and stood on the porch railing, silhouetted against the darkening sky. The bird turned its head, looking at him with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and John felt the connection pulse with meaning.